Fife4Europe is very fortunate, as all the MPs in Fife are obviously quite unequivocal in their support for the for a return to Europe, which is a good thing.
Yeah, we've had quite a lot of our MSPs as well, and the regional MSPs.
Yes.
That's good. So Alistair, you're on your own up there, but we will remember you're there. And please just shout if you want to add in something at some point.
Okay.
So I have gathered a few questions, Wendy,
yes,
from
which
various
a little bit in advance. Yes.
So we just thought it would be really helpful for us if you would like to kind of bring us up to date on where you feel things are going and what might happen over the next few months.
Yes, and then happy to answer some of those questions or think about it.
Yeah.
So if you're happy for me just to start, I think coffee is coming, which is fantastic. Thank you. One, I'm really pleased to be here in person because this is the first time that I've had the opportunity to do that. Because I was elected in December 2019 and then COVID hit. So though I will always remember very strongly that my very first week in Parliament, at the end of that week, the Friday, which also happened to be my birthday, was Brexit votes. So that was my actual first votes in Parliament. And I suppose what I would actually say as well is you know, in terms of all the MPs in Fife, I think our voting record on European issues has been pretty consistent, despite the fact that obviously there's 3 different parties represented. But in terms of what's been going on, amazing. It looks amazing. Thank you so much. In terms of what's been going on recently, I was actually talking earlier to one of our policy advisors, and I think where there is unanimity across the House of Commons is that nobody thinks that Brexit is going well. and it feels a little bit like, for those of you who don't know, children, grandchildren, those books that you get that say, this isn't my teddy bear, its fur is too fluffy, this isn't my teddy bear. And what you get from the very strong and ardent Brexiteers is the reason that they believe that Brexit is not going very well is because it's not the Brexit they voted for and it's not the Brexit they envisaged. So we are, for whatever reason, not seizing the opportunities that they saw. And I think that takes us right back to the prospectus that was presented in 2016, where a number of the areas such as freedom of movement, such as single market customs union, those were things that never seemed to be on the table during the referendum. And then we ended up obviously with the result that we ended up with, and indeed the Brexit deal that we ended up with as well. So where I think obviously we've had a huge amount of turmoil within the government. I've been reading this morning about potential reshuffles before the next election. We need no more reshuffles. I mean, I can't keep a track of who ministers are and who has responsibility. But what we have seen is, and I'm going to give very, very frank praise, is at least some degree of pragmatism, particularly in relation to Northern Ireland and the Windsor framework. And obviously, you know, as a party, we supported it because it was much better than what we had previously up until that point. And I think obviously that did feel like the point where Boris Johnson's control over the Conservatives was kind of broken from a parliamentary Conservatives because so few people actually voted against against the deal that Rishi Sunak brought forward. But I also know, so just for clarity, for those who don't know about the Liberal Democrats, the Alliance Party in Northern Ireland is our sister party. So Stephen Farry, who's the one Alliance MP in Northern Ireland, he generally takes our whip. So we know from conversations that there is still much to be done in relation to Northern Ireland. And the DUP are simply in a case now where politically I think they are trying to hold on to, they are fighting, it sounds a little bit like the Conservatives, they are fighting on their flank, the true unionist voice and those more extreme parties to kind of hold on to a diminishing population, which is why voter population, which is why we're in a position where Stormont has still not sat. But there is absolutely no doubt that relations with the EU have improved since the Windsor framework. So that's where I think nobody thinks Brexit is going well. we never had a proper prospectus for Brexit, and nobody really knows what Brexit they want, those who supported it. So those are the challenges that we are faced with. I suppose the other point that I would make is, obviously I'm here as an MP for a UK, albeit federal party. So I suppose our focus as a party is that we are looking at an electorate that voted to leave the European Union, as opposed to those who have a different view on the constitutional future of Scotland, who are obviously looking at where there was a very clear majority in Scotland to remain. But I think actually, if you put those views to the side, I think there is still a lot of opportunity for us to work together from a pro-European perspective. Because for us, our challenge is, how do we persuade people that rejoining the European Union is the right thing to do? And what I'd be keen to send round afterwards, and I'm happy to do so, is the policy motion that was approved at Liberal Democrat Spring Conference in March last year, which is rebuilding our trade and cooperation with Europe, which sets out a sort of four-part plan that we have. Because I think where we are is generally there is significant movement in the polls around how people feel about Brexit. They feel it was a bad idea, but what we are not necessarily seeing in other parts of the UK is a definitive movement for rejoin. And I think there's two reasons for that. I think because people don't like generally to admit that they're wrong. I think there is a bit of that. Yeah. And I think also there is just the fact that post-COVID, cost of living, war in Ukraine, that it is, for those people who don't care as passionately as those of us who are in the room do, that it is not a priority for people. You know, the frustration for me is that I feel that part of our economic sluggishness and lack of productivity, both in UK and Scotland, is partly driven by the fact that we've left the EU and our trading relationships are more difficult. But it's, you know, that's a conversation that we need to have, because I would not encourage you, but I did notice last week I was looking at the results from the Somerton and Froome actually all the by-elections that took place on the last day of parliamentary term, and there was a Rejoin EU party. It stood as a candidate, and they got less than, I think it was like 0.3% of the vote. So in terms of that single issue, which I think we would all love to be incredibly salient, it's not as salient as we would want it to be. So I think that is why we as a party are focused on what are the key things that we can be doing to rebuild our relationship with the EU. And, you know, let's be honest, not having Boris Johnson or indeed Liz Truss as a Prime Minister is part of an improvement there. But there's no doubt that post the general election, I think there will be better opportunities to rebuild those relationships. In terms of some of the particular issues, what I would say is, you know, I do think Horizon will be resolved in the next couple of months. It's coming, it's back and forward, but conversations I've had within Westminster, and also conversations I've had, obviously University of St Andrews is the largest employer in my constituency, and so, you know, we know how critical Horizon is. I think that the politics that are being worked out here is the politics within the Conservative Party, rather than anybody thinking not being in Horizon is a good idea. So I think that is one of the key things. I think it's very interesting, of course, that we've ended up in a situation where the government has again kicked the can down the road in relation to imports to the UK around phytosanitary issues, etc. And I think that is that's a very obvious recognition that putting those barriers in place will do exactly that. They will cause barriers. In terms of things that I have been doing, I actually have a debate coming up in Parliament when we return. I can't remember if it's an adjournment debate or a Westminster Hall on the Turing scheme, because I also want to illustrate that the Turing scheme is a very pale comparison to what we had in relation to Erasmus, particularly, you know, in terms of reciprocal arrangements that Erasmus gave us. And just this week, I mean, obviously North East Fife, is it the soft fruit capital? I mean, I'm sure Angus would have something to say about that, but I was actually at Allen Hill Farm just outside St Andrews on Monday for a visit there. I'm well engaged with Ian Brown, who is at Easter Grange. We're just outside Pittenweem, and he is the soft fruits committee chair under NFUS. And we've been having an ongoing conversation around seasonal agricultural workers. At the root of all of that, frankly, is the Home Office. And the Home Office are completely focused on the small boats issue, because by focusing on that, they hope to mask the fact that actual overall migration figures are increasing. And I'm sure many of you in here are like-minded than me that why is migration a bad thing? When if we are building the public services and infrastructure that can manage that migration, frankly, we need it. And we certainly need it in places like North East Fife, where hospitality, tourism and agriculture have all been impacted by not being able to have people come and work in our communities. So in terms of what's very interesting, I'm trying to remember, I've definitely had at least one debate, and in fact it was last year, I had one debate on seasonal agricultural workers, or employment in agriculture generally. At that time, it was Victoria Prentice, who's now the Attorney General, who was the Minister in DEFRA that responded to me, but really frustratingly, it was allocated to DEFRA, even though you request Home Office. So DEFRA make a number of right noises, but the reality is in terms of visas and those controls, it's in the hands of the Home Office. Now, Mark Spencer, who is the relatively new farming minister, I know from when he was the government chief whip. I'm not sure whether he thinks he's got a better deal now as DEFRA minister as opposed to working under Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. But he is a farmer. I think he acknowledges some of the challenges, but he is very short-term focused. So he sees it as a significant achievement that he's an agreement from the Home Office to extend the seasonal agricultural worker scheme for another year. The point that I have made is that that doesn't help farmers to plan, it doesn't help the certainty. The government say quite a lot that farmers should be looking at automation. I can't think of a piece of plant machinery that would be in a position to pick strawberries to the way a human can currently, though I accept that there'll be automation opportunities elsewhere. But how can farmers make the investment that they need to make in automation if they don't have the certainty in terms of where their next workforce is coming? When I was at Allen Hill on Monday, they do have a proportion of people with settled status who are returning, and that's important for them because that's part of their workforce that train people and train new staff. But one of the other challenges they're facing is around the current seasonal agricultural worker scheme. Requires a 6-month gap between leaving the UK and coming back. So they have had a couple of circumstances where they've had good employees coming across, and now they're coming further afield. They're coming from places like Turkmenistan and Kyrgyzstan, etc. A number of those old Soviet Union republics. But if they get a good person who came out on the 1st of July, and then they want them to come out again for the start at mid-June, they can't get that person back, depending on when they stop working for them. So there's all these little bits around the scheme. I mean, I'm not going to say that we shouldn't have the scheme. I think we absolutely need the scheme, given the current circumstances we're in. But that's some of the particular issues that are coming up that are very local to North East Fife and my constituency. So in short, I think we're in for a long haul. I think there is a movement, and you are seeing a move in the polls. But I think it's interesting. I was out in Washington last year with Results UK around some work that I had done around COVID vaccinations and the Global South and access. And we had a meeting with the US State Department. And one of their stakeholders was actually reflecting on the fact that, there's so much focus around how the UK, the impact on the UK of Brexit, but they were actually reflecting on the fact that that the EU has changed, and the EU has changed for the negative without the UK as part of it. And I think we only need to look at sort of the political situation and changing dynamics in a number of European countries to recognise that. So, this is not a straightforward rejoin scenario that if we convince sufficient people. I think there are clearly learnings that we've had, everybody's had around the prospectus and the hard questions not being answered. but I think we accept that it would be a different relationship going forward, were we to rejoin. That's my party's policy through our 4-step programme. I know that's what you all want here, but I think we just need to keep working, keep convincing, keep changing people's minds, and I think there will be opportunities, particularly come the general election and beyond, for the situation to improve, without us being in a position where we have rejoined. And I think I'll take questions from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. That did cover a lot of the things that are sort of most interesting to us. I think we're all really disappointed, given the Windsor framework and so forth, that Horizon still isn't up and running. I'm sure it's a big issue for you. So that's probably about the only really positive bit that you said, that you think that might be within 2 months.
If you're very interested in what goes on in Westminster, there's a daily email you can sign up to called a Playbook, which is done by the website Political. And to be honest, the majority of Westminster, it drops at about 7:20 in the morning. It's just very good for picking up those kind of bits of information. And over the last 3 months, Horizon has appeared 2 or 3 times where it's apparently close to being done. And if it was an absolutely rule out, I think we would know that. I think we would know that by now. And
I don't see how it can be, because it was part of the original agreement. And I mean, to turn to Erasmus, it's great that you're having a debate soon, but I think it's the same. You know, it could have very much been part. It was supposed to be part of the original agreement, and it's just the UK.
And it was a last minute rule out. With the Scottish Affairs Committee, which I'm a member of, we did an inquiry on universities in Scotland, and when we had the UK government minister, I think there was a sort of failure of understanding of what Erasmus did. I do think from a Scottish Government perspective, they obviously committed to introducing Erasmus replacement, and that hasn't happened. I think clearly with the fact that Wales have moved forward with TAFE, there's clearly lessons for the Scottish Government there. But I also think that the Scottish Government's direction of travel suggests that, you know, that the university and further education sector is going to be less of a focus for them. They're quite clearly focused on the schools. So I think we need to, you know, those of us who, you know, want to ensure the Scottish Government do that need to continue to call for it, but I think we need to be realistic that it doesn't seem to be as much of a priority as potentially previously it was.
We have just relaunched our sort of Erasmus efforts with this Unlock Erasmus campaign, and the Scottish Government officials that we most recently met with told us that there will be a pilot before the end of the year.
Oh, that's great to hear. Really,
which is good, but because also in Northern Ireland, Dublin's basically bankrolling an equivalent. So we'll feel like we're the only ones. Besides, I hope it can also be mentioned in your debate.
Yes,
even if it's taking the tunes.
Yes, yeah. Well, what I'll do is I'm assuming if officials have said that to you, I'll be able to get that confirmation from the Scottish Government quite readily. So that would be great. I'd be really pleased if that's the case.
But what I had heard is that actually towards the end of the whole negotiation process, when it became clear how different, how the Erasmus Plus part of Plus, which is the school stuff and the stuff for apprentices and sports groups and so on, and less the tertiary education level, was the bit that it's got the British government trying to say that's actually pretty costly for a lot of money.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was actually, and when I referred to the Scottish Affairs Committee, that was actually the question I asked Ian Stewart, which was, tell me a group of people that will benefit from Turing that didn't benefit from Erasmus in terms of the population, and he couldn't give me one. He couldn't give me one, and that was obviously part of their
all the people who will not benefit from Turing, who would have benefited.
Yes. And you know, I did a year, it was at Lodger College when I worked there as a part-time comms lecturer. So you know, I think we need to do so much more to support our further education sector as well, and give people in further education the opportunities that potentially are more common for university students. So that's exactly the kind of areas that I would hope the Scottish Government's pilot might look at too.
Yeah, because now the universities, I think, are much more able to maintain, because the Scottish universities have fantastic links to Erasmus, and they can keep those going.
Yes. And I think a number of them are probably trying to, you know, keep those connections warm, as it were.
Yeah, I've had nephews from France coming to Harriet Walk without any Erasmus money, but it's still there.
Yes.
So the whole thing of the primary school teacher who would never have got the money to go to learn about teaching languages at that level and come back and share it.
Yes,
but that's not happening. There's no way that's going to happen.
And on that's a huge concern generally, is the fall in numbers of students learning modern languages.
Yes.
And certainly in conversations I'd had with somebody at Cardiff University in relation to TAFE was the fact that that part of what Erasmus did was provide support through modern language and teaching opportunities to build, because part of the reason I think we are seeing a fall in foreign language teaching or students studying is because we've got a shortage of foreign language teachers as well.
Like the shortage of agri workers, as you discussed, and it's just, is Labour doing anything towards the Home Office with you, or how can the Home Office be beaten on this? It's just such a no-brainer. It's
on. I'll be honest, on every single front, the Home Office is a blocker.
Yeah.
Every single front. So I also co-chair so in terms of all-party parliamentary groups, there's a couple that I'm involved with, but in terms of those that I sort of chair or co-chair, I co-chair the Afghan Women and Girls APPG, and in relation to Afghanistan, it's pretty shameful. Yeah. But again, in terms of that, it feels like a number of, and this isn't just about the EU, but that sort of the real hollowness of some of that global Britain debate, because actually one of the other things where we've seen a great deal of cuts is around the British Council. Now, the British Council provided a lot of valuable work around teaching English as a foreign language and foreign language training, but also just that cultural impact and work with embassies, etc. And I'm not heavily involved with the British Council APPG, but I get copied into stuff. But there are a group of British Council workers currently stuck in Pakistan who obviously fled Afghanistan. And and Pakistan isn't the safest place for people to be either. No. So it just does feel, one of my arguments around the small boats is actually if we reinstated 0.7 our foreign aid and actually improved the conditions in the countries where people are fleeing from, then we would have less people coming in small boats. But yeah.
So we should open the floor a bit. Would anyone else like to raise an issue with Wendy?
Can I ask just one very quick small one on top of that? I saw something very recently, which was the dramatic reduction in foreign students coming to the United Kingdom. And there was meant to be some kind of scheme so that not all these because the school children coming, because before they didn't need to have a passport. Yes. And it was something that they were meant to be sorting. Well, that seems to also be put in that fund. And it's over 80% reduction, which is costing huge.
So that's in terms of school trips going into and yes. There's an issue going out as well. So my understanding is in terms of UK students going to Europe, part of the challenge of that is sort of being post-COVID. My son's just going into 5th year and he hasn't had a school trip in high school. That's, obviously as a result of COVID as part of that. But, I have been saying to him, is there anything planned? Is there going to be any opportunities? So I think, and that's been partly border delays, but I think it's also been some of those issues. But in terms of coming in, those numbers don't surprise me, but let me go and do a bit more digging to see, because that certainly sounds like something.
So I think we're looking for possibilities where we can have closer European integration. It doesn't really matter too much almost what they are. The more that we have, the better our quality of life and the better yes. I think it yes. will be for the yes. United Kingdom yes. as well as Scotland. And we're missing out on yes. huge amounts of potential.
And I think that's part of where the debate has got to in Parliament, is that the European Union and Europe are kind of used interchangeably by those from the Brexiteer contingent. I attended a debate on the Council of Europe that is the MP for Henley that's just standing down. Is it John Howell? So he is the UK parliamentarian who's the representative from Council of Europe. And he was basically talking as a Conservative MP about, the benefits of being part of the Council of Europe. And again, you had yeah, let's just say that my imposter syndrome has definitely decreased since I came into Parliament, in terms of, you know, some of the parliamentarians that you listen to. But, you know, people saying we should leave the Council of Europe, people saying that we should leave the European Court of Human Rights, because they tie it all up into the European Union. It's a real issue. And, you know, the intervention I made in that debate to John, which of course he completely agreed with, was the fact that, you know, people are talking about leaving these ECHR. You know, the only other country that's done that is Russia. Do we agree that that's probably not company that the UK wants to keep? But that is, you know.
And Belarus.
Yes, and Belarus. Yes, yes. Belarus is also the only other European nation that's a democracy that has, or a democracy that has first past the post. So yeah. But so yeah, I'll write a wee note to myself, and I'll see if I can raise a couple of, because part of the challenge now for universities is that the number of foreign students that they welcome now in order to balance their books. That is just simply the reality. But if people can't actually come to experience the UK in the first instance, then they might make a different decision about where they come to study internationally thereafter.
Because most of them are now going to Ireland.
Yeah, judging by how busy Dublin is these days.
Yes, I was wondering, given all the complications and difficulties and obstacles that there are around, I agree obviously with the general sentiment that the more individual bits we can achieve, the better.
Yes.
But I'm wondering if some sort of framework needs to be proposed. So the idea of a cooperation treaty, which is in the list of questions that went your way, I think, may be something worth thinking about. If so far we have got our departure treaty and our trade treaty with the EU, and then the Northern Ireland add-on to that, the aim of the cooperation treaty in my book would be that both Britain and the EU sign it, and it would enable them to cooperate on anything they chose to cooperate on. And that, well, that would likely lead in positive directions, because anything that's not banned by the existing treaties is immediately possible.
Yes.
And then all you have to do is talk the various bits and pieces through and agree what to do next. And it bypasses the issue of do we rejoin? And you can't, it's a moving bus. Yes. So you can't rejoin in the sense of getting on where you left. That's not possible. And we could equally, in such negotiations, be faced with, well, you must accept everything that's happened, you must accept the euro, etc., which would make it difficult to get support to rejoin. So cooperation seems to be a better way forward.
Yes. So yeah, so Clive, I need to probably go and look at it a little bit more, but I suppose my attitude is given that we are the only country to have left the European Union, it does put us in a very unique position as we build our relationship going forward with a view to rejoin. So I think there absolutely is opportunities for us to look at those kind of things. As I say, I've got the 4-point plan that we've got as party policy, but you know, even the Labour Party, so obviously you know, they have said that they accept the result of the referendum, and indeed it's obviously interesting because I said that my very first votes in Parliament were in relation to Brexit in December 2019, and then the following year, around about the same time, was the votes in relation to the deal. And obviously Labour took a different view to ourselves in the SNP in relation to that deal. So their argument was that they thought it was a terrible deal. They thought they could have, you know, negotiated a better deal. But given that that was the deal on the table, as opposed to no deal, they would support it. Whereas both ourselves and the SNP, I mean, I can't speak for the SNP's reasons, but for our reasons, it was a case of this is a terrible deal. We want nothing to do with it. Go away and negotiate something else, because realistically, that's what you're going to do other than no deal. But, you know, I think that has given us a bit of opportunity in recent months to say, well, we didn't vote for that, whereas obviously that's more challenging for Labour. But I think also, you know, some of the narrative around how do we rebuild some of our relationships, how do we deal with some of the issues such as phytosanitary checks, all those kind of things, they are talking some of that same language. So and potentially, you know, maybe more open to sort of setting out a better framework around what the areas that they cooperate on look like. Because I suppose that is, you know, that is the reality and potentially the opportunity of next year is the general election, that at a UK level it does feel like we are going to have a change of government. And because the narrative around need for change is there, I don't think there's necessarily loads of enthusiasm for the alternatives currently, but it does feel that the Conservatives are now in a position where they're not going to recover sufficiently to be able to and not only from the perspective of how bad the polls are for them currently, but even if they pull back to some way, they have kind of burnt their bridges with everybody that they might, you know, look to work with. So.
I mean, things are so bad under the present government that nothing can change without the present government going. I mean, that's fairly clear. And attitudes in Europe and in the EU have greater chance of changing with a new government that is not the present one.
But it's quite clear, and I think the Windsor framework does show that the EU, you know, the EU have not taken the position that they can never work with the Conservatives currently. I think they have shown a degree of pragmatism and engaged with Sunak's government.
I'm suggesting they may need to show quite a lot more pragmatism before it becomes feasible to gain popular support in this country, given its low priority for any form of rejoin. And that, I think, would be the utility of a cooperation treaty. The worst case scenario is it gets vetoed by the EU and you end up seeing can we work with some countries and not others. So that might not be helpful. No,
I don't think it would be helpful. I mean, obviously the other big issue is the war in Ukraine. And yes, in some respects, the UK was seen as sort of working, you know, quite strident in terms of its support for UK and bringing people on. But for me, what could we have achieved if we'd been part of the EU in terms of being able to show that that single body of support? And indeed, I think we might even have seen some movement in relation to Finland and Sweden quicker than we did in relation to NATO as well. Because again, I think, you know, obviously the blocker for Sweden in terms of NATO has been Turkey, and again that sort of single body support from an EU perspective might have made that happen a bit quicker. And that is, you know, I suppose the issue is that Ukraine situation, the war, it doesn't feel like it's going to end anytime soon. But that whole situation, that whole geopolitical situation, and again, Scottish Affairs Committee, we've just done an inquiry into the North Atlantic and the High North in relation to defence. You know, even when the war does end, and those, you know, the geopolitics there are going to be very difficult. And when Putin goes, and I suspect the likelihood of Putin going at the end of a rope is much higher than it's been there was previously. What comes after, and frankly, there's nothing to suggest that it will be any better.
Well, you want to say something?
Wendy, is there ever any discussion around Europol in Westminster? There have been any debates or sort of public discussions, but surely with the sort of increasing sophistication of international crime, and I mean, we hear something new and appalling every single day. The fact that we're not now part of Europol is really a big issue for the UK.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think we've ended up with some agreements around data sharing that was better than it was. But well, again, this is one of those situations for me from a policing perspective. I was a police officer for 12 years, and obviously policing has seen an erosion of trust in the last couple of years as well. But again, this is where Europol is weakened by the loss of the UK from it, and as well as us not being able to access some of those information as well. I'm not aware of anything recently,
no, it's
but so in terms of Lib Dems, I occasionally pick up some policing stuff. So I played on the public order bill for the Lib Dems, even though it was mostly England and Wales, because I've got a policing background. But generally, I'm not totally plugged in. But again, that's one that I could go away and ask a couple of questions on to see what the current situation is.
Yeah, I think there should be sort of an increased awareness among, well, I don't know how aware MPs are, but I think it's quite a serious issue for the UK.
Yes, particularly on serious organised crime, and we'll take that back to small boats. Who's responsible? Who's ultimately responsible for that? And second of all, increases in fraud.
Cybersecurity also. I mean, there are more and more instances of, we had SIPA, didn't we? And was that last year or the year before? But there's been big charities, Woodland Trust and other things. You might not think charities are, you don't associate them with crime, but there's an awful lot of money moving around in charities and all sorts of ways in which things can be interpreted. And I think the Europol issue is really quite serious.
Okay.
I think it's a good example. There are just so many different. We talk about Horizon, Interpol, Erasmus. All these ones are actually, they're connected to the EU, but not part of the EU. And there's so many different ways that we could work, as Clive said, more in a cooperative way, without having to sign up necessarily right away. And I think they're part of the building blocks to rejoin. I think one of the biggest things that we talk about sometimes at the stall is the single market. And we don't have to be part of the EU to be a member of the single market either. And that, I think, is something a lot of people on the street are becoming more aware of. Whereas at the time of the referendum, most people probably didn't know that much about it. So small businesses,
people were supporting Brexit said that we wouldn't be leaving the EU, the customs union and the single market if we left the EU.
The single market has huge implications for the rights of farmers, fishermen, etc., getting their produce into the market. Correct. So that's probably another.
I mean, if I talk about it from the party perspective at the moment, if Liberal Democrats, we've won 4 by-elections since the start of this Parliament, and other than Cheshire and Amersham, which was the first one, there a pro-Remain majority in that seat. The other areas, Tiverton and Honiton, North Shropshire, and more latterly Somerton Froome, all voted to leave. So in some ways you think, how are the Lib Dems winning there? And part of it is, the farming community in England feels completely betrayed by the UK government. Because what they were promised hasn't been delivered, the replacement schemes to replace EU funding and CAP, etc., are still not up and running. There's issues with IT, all the very common things you would expect to be problems. And third of all, it's not just in terms of those replacements, it's third of all the fact that they feel that the UK is making trade deals, so Australia and New Zealand is a good example of that are fundamentally working against farmers in the UK's interests. And from a food security perspective, that's incredibly concerning, because we've all got used to being able to buy strawberries, for example, all year round in our supermarkets, and people are used to having that consumer choice. And I'm sure you were all as frustrated as me when we saw the news articles around food shortages and all the different excuses to bend it over that it was nothing to do with Brexit. And all those other factors, would have been a factor, but let's not kid ourselves, Brexit's at the heart of it.
I'm sorry to say that I hadn't read, but I have now. So I was looking at my phone, the detail of your 4-point or your 4-stage plan. Because what I was going to ask was whether that would mean that come the campaign for the next election, ultimately you would be saying that the Lib Dem aim is to rejoin the EU, but the fourth point, when you go to the part of joining the single market, I presume, knowing your own views, you're hoping that there will be a 5th point added at some point.
Yeah, so this is realistic in terms of it's rebuilding our relationship with the EU, but our party policy states that we are rebuilding those trade and cooperation with Europe with a view to rejoining. And I think that's an important part.
So that will feature in the manifesto, but it is. to rejoin.
Yeah.
Well, that's really good to hear, because it doesn't come over in African.
Well, I suppose this is where the politics comes in, isn't it? Given the point that I've just made, and I suppose again, what's the salient point?
And we don't want to rerun all the rest. We want to the election, but people do want to know that.
Yes, and I suppose when we, we need to campaign on the salient points to people, but that doesn't mean that our fundamentals have changed. You know, obviously recognise some Lib Dem colleagues here. You know, we were on the street stall in Dunfermline in 2016. This is, you know, something that frankly is in sort of our DNA from an internationalism perspective. So, you know, it might not be front and centre of what we're talking about, but you know, it is like a stick of rock for us.
I think the advantage is that we're beginning to see a significant shift. People are in the recent opinion polls, you strip out the don't knows, we're beginning to see a consistent majority now for rejoin. And that hasn't been apparent until probably the last year or so. But we're also beginning to see more people like Sadiq Khan and others beginning to voice. And I think that's been very welcome for us. And hopefully one of the things that our job is to do is to raise the profile as much as we can, which is why we do our street stalls. There's the National Rejoin March that's coming up in London in September. So which is
sadly the same weekend as our conference in Bournemouth.
Yes, I saw that. So there are
we haven't had an in-person one we haven't had an autumn conference in person since I was elected.
There are some other events that we've got in Scotland, and we were talking about one of them just before we came in, which is the tour of something called Our Star. And it was a star that was made to be kept in the European Parliament on behalf of the United Kingdom. And there's Our Star, which we would like to get back again. So that is coming, and it will be coming to Fife. And that's something I think Joe would like to.
Yeah, we'd really love you to be involved with that.
Great. If we
can, we've arranged the programme so that we hope that it'll be housed. We're trying to get Lib Dem Government to help us to house it in the university.
So now the chair of the movement.
And hopefully that'll be a Sunday night, so that maybe before you left on Monday morning you could come along and welcome the Star to Fife.
Excellent. And hope that other reps will be able to join me too.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe depending where we've got to with Horizon at that point, the principal of the university ought to be there Horizon a bit more. And the 5 points of the Star are supposed to, the aim, it's going to spend a fortnight in various different regions of the UK. It's obviously coming in the Eurostar from Brussels. It's being looked after by Terry Renke.
Oh yes, very good.
And she did her Erasmus in Edinburgh, so we're hoping that she'll come for the main, what they want to happen in each fortnight is a sort of citizens forum, where we look not just about where the UK should be in relation to the EU, but where the UK should be in general in the future in relation to democratic status and all of the other things that have gone a bit off the rails recently. And the 5 points of the Star are meant to signify different aspects of sort of life and how we should be dealing with them. And so we're going to look at which bits we do in which bit of Scotland that we probably do with agriculture, environment, things when it stops in power. We haven't quite decided exactly what the key thing, but a bit on education and then maybe a bit on sort of the social point of the Star when it may stop at certain firm and in Dundee we're going to do that with the SNP Heather Anderson.
He's a former MEP, is that right?
Exactly, and she gave us a really fantastic, incredibly emotional presentation of her, whatever it was, 6 weeks or her very short period as an MEP. And she's helped us to try to grow a group in Dundee as well.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that nobody's sitting on their laurels. It's that the work continues. That's really good to hear. And I'm very conscious that, you know, was it the last meeting I was at, like John Purvis was there, and obviously, you know, that for me is one of the strengths of Fife4Europe, and indeed European movement in Scotland, is that cross-party ways of working, and I know he's much missed.
Yes, could I ask, wind back to politics and ask you to peer into the soul of the Labour Party? They'll probably form the next government. How do you see their thinking evolving on the EU?
So I think they've obviously got mixed groupings in their rankings, but I think they are being quite ruthless in terms of how they look to the next election. Well, there's been quite a lot of change from the Labour Party in relation to some of their policies over the last bit. I think, I think the issue is that they don't want to show a flank to the Conservatives, particularly in those kind of red wall seats, which are pretty essential to them for winning back. But I think that generally they are a pro-European party in terms of amongst their elected representatives. But I think they are, they will also do what's in Labour's best interest. I mean, another good example of that is electoral reform, where despite the fact that they've actually had a change of party policy in terms of electoral reform, Starmer says that it's not something that they're interested in pursuing. And frankly, the reason the reason for that is, we currently operate with first past the post, a two-party system, and they're one of the two parties.
Like the Liberal Party in 1917.
Yes, and it's also like 1997, where there was an expectation that they would look at that, but once you have a big, huge landslide, you just think, I'd like to keep having that. So it's difficult to gauge, obviously, because dare I say it, in terms of their only Scottish MP representation at Westminster is Ian Murray, who is the shadow Scottish Secretary. But the general feeling I get is from the other relationships that I've got across other APPGs, there are few within the Labour ranks who are ardent Brexiteers, but they're also pragmatic and looking at potentially their electoral prospects. So that's not probably very helpful, but I genuinely don't know, but that's just my feeling.
Yeah. Well, Paul mentioned the single market. Do you see that as a possibility for a Labour option?
I think part of the challenge is that there are, again, some of these people say these words, and there's still that, you said that there's an increased understanding of what the impact is, but people say a word and then there's assumption after assumption after assumption made. So I think, they would probably want to see something incredibly similar to that, but they're probably in a position where they feel that they necessarily can't say that. Would that be fair?
Just following on from the same thing. Okay, we're going to fight a general election. They don't want to upset the red wall Brexiters.
Yes, that's right.
That is the election.
Yes.
Once the election is fought and hopefully the Tories are out, and maybe there even be maybe representation between the Lib Dems and the SNP will actually hold balance. You never even know. But once the election is over, they don't need to make the promises anymore.
No.
Can you see them actually turning around and sitting down and talking about single market at least?
I think there's a number of things that if they want to govern successfully, as opposed to continue to have electoral success, that they should get on and tackle. If we think about, Joe mentioned it in terms of some of the democratic issues we have within our democracy in the UK, they might not be issues that are front and centre of people's minds, but actually if we want to improve people's long-term prospects. But I'd be speaking for a party that I'm not a member of, but I think they've got, back to that bit of, if they want to govern successfully, if they want to deal with the productivity lag that we've been experiencing in the UK at some time, if they want to deal with the sluggish economy that sees us as, at the bottom of the list from a G7 perspective, they need to do things. And one of the things they need to do is radically improve our relationships with our nearest choosing partner.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think address some of what's happened to our democratic structure in this country over the last X years, 8 years, particularly the lack of judicial review, and not being able to say what you like in public and march and all those things that were affected by that bill.
Yeah, Joanna Cherry and I, we were the two Scots who spoke in the public or all the stages of the public order bill. Her in her role as the joint chair of the European Human Rights joint committee, and myself as the former police officer, and so which was always the funny bit. It's like, you're a police officer, former police officer, you don't want more powers, and I'm like, no, because that's not actually what we're supposed to be about. We're supposed to be about facilitating peaceful protest, not about clamping down on it. So there's now, and that's where, you know, you said that potentially where other parties might do and the balance that they might hold. You know, I'm obviously hoping that there's sufficient contingent where on a number of those things, such as, you know, public order, and what's the other thing that the government said, that the illegal migration bill, that Labour have said that they wouldn't look to immediately repeal. These are the kind of things that we absolutely do need to hold their feet to the fire on. No doubt about it. Yes. So, but I think the other thing is actually around the whole standards, the whole parliamentary standards piece, and there's absolutely no doubt the erosion of that, particularly through Boris Johnson, has been. If we go right back, November 2021, Owen Patterson, the debate on emergency debate on standards, post that was my debate. I had made the emergency application for that, and it was just at a very basic level. What had happened was, when that vote took place, if you're aware of it, this was Owen Patterson, former MP for North Shropshire. He'd been sanctioned by the Standards Committee for paid lobbying. And what happens is the Standards Committee makes a recommendation, but the actual Parliament has to vote for it, because I'm nobody's employee. I suppose, even though I'm Chief Whip, I'm nobody's line manager. Ed Davies not my boss. Alex Williams isn't my boss. I'm only responsible to my constituents. And what really got me was the fact that Owen Patterson was the subject of that report, but he was able to vote against his own sanction. So you get to be the defendant and the jury, and it just so and it did. I mean, yes, I think there's been an erosion, but I think, and particularly maybe when you look to the United States, I do think some of it has held firm. Boris Johnson is no longer Prime Minister, and his prospects of being Prime Minister again are very slim. We can't say that in relation to Trump. But again, I suppose just in terms of what are the things that you can do to improve the situation, I managed to table an amendment to a review of the Code of Conduct, which means that that's no longer the case, which was, so it's a simple, straightforward thing to do in terms of improving those standards. But it's really depressing, because I remember when I was going to have conversations with a couple of MPs on the Standards Committee, and they said, well, basically it's it's precedent that nobody would vote in relation to their own sanction, which only works until somebody chooses to break that. So yeah,
but they've broken so many things.
Yes.
And what I'm really scared about is that it's sort of fallen to such disrepute. You'll not get enthusiastic young people to join politics.
I'm really conscious of that. Really conscious of that. On the other hand, I did go to the Elect Her Day that was in the Scottish Parliament a few weeks ago, and the number of people women that were there, a number from different backgrounds and ages, was quite encouraging.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's no doubt that there are aspects of the job in relation to trust in politicians, but also social media, all those kind of things that do make it quite challenging. I always joke that I get lots of Brian May comparisons, so I can laugh at them. The other stuff I ignore.
I think part of the problem is that the EU referendum was used as an excuse and a reason to actually clamp down on a lot of our democracies. The MPs themselves voted not to have a vote on the treaties.
The parliamentary sovereignty. Yes,
that's some of the things I would hope that might be rolled back in the future.
Yes.
I mean, as we said earlier, there's only one other place that has first past the post, so there's such a ton of things that we've performed in our parliamentary process, really.
Yeah, and that's the worry I have, is that the next parliament won't have time to do so much of this stuff, because so much has happened in the last parliament.
Regardless of what my status might be after the next general election, if I'm not returned as an MP, I can certainly look back and think that I packed quite a lot happened.
So that was great to go off into sort of more general politics, but just to kind of bring it back a little bit to Europe. We had a really interesting EMIS webinar last week, which was called Scotland Would Rejoin the EU Tomorrow If Asked, But How? And for us as a cross-party organisation, very difficult to do that.
Yes, no, I appreciate that.
Because there's the independence room.
Yes.
So we invited Stephen Giffins and Eddie Barnes.
Oh, yes. Who now works with Scotland's Future.
Exactly. So the Gordon Brown think tank, but he was conservative. Yeah. So interesting. And in a way, I think what came out of it is a bit like your 4 steps, because I think eventually by the end they both recognise that it's not going to be instant. No. I mean, Stephen didn't keep going back to the fact that it might not be that far away, but it has to be small steps to begin with. And so, you know, maybe the 3 opposition parties will not actually be that far apart. The campaign for the election. Absolutely. But I do hope that Labour can be persuaded it is going to be taking steps.
And I think this is, I can understand why it's challenging, but I think that's why it's really important that you continue to be cross-party, because I suppose in you know, if we look back to both the referendum results, you know, 45% in terms of Scottish independence, 62% in Scotland in support of remaining in the EU. And, you know, if you only to focus on an independent Scotland within the EU, you're potentially losing the support of the majority in the current circumstances. So I think, how can we focus on the things that we can do? And there's also just that honest part that actually, you know, regardless of your view of Scotland's place within the UK, and if the UK is in Europe, or if the rest of the UK is in Europe and there's an independent Scotland, a number of the issues, particularly the economic and barrier issues, become easier to address. And so, you know, I don't see how those need to be in conflict with one another. I've not met Eddie before, but obviously I know Stephen, and so I'm, you know, for all that it's difficult, I can't think of, you know, a better person to kind of have that, you know, sort of general conversation in a positive way, rather than it being quite
and I think that was really appreciated. We had a lot of people come into that webinar from all over the country and beyond, actually. Yes. There were quite a lot of comments in the chat about how it was such an open and positive discussion compared to discussions in other parts of the UK. So that was interesting.
To get that. Because yes, we would all join the EU tomorrow if we could, but that's not the circumstances we find ourselves in. So how do we make it more likely that other people who necessarily don't feel like us can be made to feel like us? And there's practical steps we can do to improve that situation.
But all these reforms we've just talked about that are needed in Westminster have to come quite quickly too, because that's the other reason that I think people would be prepared to leave the rest of the UK behind.
Yes, and you know, I would obviously say that just because I genuinely believe that Scotland is better to be in the UK and in the EU doesn't mean that I think that the UK doesn't need to change or the status quo is in any way acceptable. And I suppose part of the reason for my view of that is because the internationalist viewpoint of my party is that barriers tend to not be good things, regardless of whether they're within island nations or elsewhere.
Well, that's been a really broad and far-reaching discussion, actually. So thank you very much. Just double check if anybody has anything else. Yes, Tom.
I was unaware, in conjunction with the Edinburgh Festival, there's a festival of politics, and there are events going on down in Holyrood. And I went along to one of the, or we went along to one of these, might have even been this week, about sustainable aviation. Now, you might think that's I don't think that's a funny sort of term, because I don't see it as being terribly possible. But I was quite surprised the extent to which the speakers mentioned Brexit as one of the problems in respect of developing the aviation industry. The aviation, the airlines, Chambers of Commerce, they are all pro more flying, which, as an environmentalist, I have problems with. But they are convinced that there's going to be this wonderful, magic, sustainable aviation fuel which will enable them to continue to expand without ruining the planet. Which isn't possible, but that's beside it. But it did make me think, that we have got to be part of international, part of a bigger block. We can't do things on our own. It's very difficult to do these things on your own, because if you're going to use something like sustain, it is going to be more expensive than stuff that just pops out of the ground.
And I think this is where we are in the overall climate debate, where the sort of, I think there's the public acceptance that we need to do something. Some of the low-hanging fruit, I think there's still a lot more that we can do, has gone. But actually, we are now starting to have conversations about things that will directly impact people's lives. And until we actually focus on the end, the demand, you know, if we turn the taps off, there's chaos, as opposed to how do we move quickly enough so that the taps can get turned off sooner. And you know, and interestingly, just on the European bit, I don't know anything about this area really at all, Tom, except that again, Scottish Affairs Committee, we've done a renewable energy inquiry and a hydrogen inquiry. As part of the hydrogen inquiry, we went out to Cologne in Germany to see at the Shell site the EU project in relation to hydrogen production, using wind power that they had on that site, because that's obviously one of the discussions about hydrogen. Could we use where wind farms are curtailed? Could we use that to produce hydrogen? And what was quite interesting was they were quite clear that they saw hydrogen as as a solution to some of the heavier industry transportation issues, and aviation was part of that. I also met somebody a few weeks ago in Parliament who was looking at ammonia for ships. I'm not necessarily. I didn't. Yeah, because certainly I came away from that hydrogen inquiry thinking I'm not convinced about hydrogen into people's homes. But I think there are key areas such as transportation, heavy transportation, where hydrogen is an option. But the final point on that was that we were shown round by the representatives of a British company who basically built the hardware on site in Germany. So, and that was partly because obviously the project had started before we had left the EU, but they were certainly hopeful that, you know, the relationships they built meant that there would be further opportunities down for them on the line, and that's got to be a benefit to the UK as well, that expertise is then developed here too.
And there is a European carbon cost. If you emit a ton of carbon dioxide, it costs you X euros. We pulled out of that when we left the EU. We got our own carbon cost scheme. And what has been recently done, we've handed out more free credits so that the price of the carbon dioxide emissions in this country doesn't go up too much, which is, again, it's another retrograde step.
It's short-termism.
Yes.
And also that air and water do not recognise national boundaries, and that's why I love the fact that most of the work I did in Brussels was on environment legislation, because you have to legislate at a higher level than national level.
Yes. Sometimes something that I can't remember, so it's not going to be helpful. But Michael Turvey has recently, who's been adopted as a PPC for Liberal Democrats in West Aberdeen. He has a very real question to address in where do you get the better jobs if the oil industry disappears out of Aberdeen? And he has mentioned something to do with ammonia, and that's where I wish I could remember what he had said, because he clearly did know what he was talking about. And he says that there are prospects of developing the use of ammonia in a way which will have some good jobs. Too many of the wind farm alternatives are very low employment and straightforward employment, so they don't recreate the sort of jobs that the oil industry had. But he was working on it. I think it was probably unfinished business as far as he was concerned, but he was seriously thinking about it.
You can use the hydrogen. A lot of it is electrolysis to get hydrogen. You can then react that in all sorts of ways. One of it, react it with nitrogen, you get ammonia. And that's which you can liquefy and then use as a fuel. It's quite calorific.
There are two types of hydrogen. There's white and blue hydrogen. They have different. So be very careful what we're talking.
Yes.
So grey is produced from
natural gas.
And from fossil fuels. Blue is
from natural gas. You capture the carbon dioxide.
Capture the carbon through the cluster, which is why the acorn cluster is so important.
And third is green. Found naturally as well underground.
Yes.
Yes.
That's the, I think that's what they call a white, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a limited amount of it though.
Yeah, I agree. It's what the oil companies are drilling, looking for.
There's going to be a programme on the World Service about that, about some new deposits found in it.
Okay.
And they're believed to be bigger than was first believed.
My other concern, and I know this isn't Europe's stuff in relation to Europe, but is just the fact that I think we just, you know, when I think about electric cars and batteries, and then you see some of the footage from, you know, Congo and other areas of the world where obviously they're excavating lithium. I don't want us, well, I'm concerned that we end up in a situation where the West's sort of desire to be green actually has environmental impacts and damage in other parts of the world.
Yeah, I haven't worked out what to do with all batteries really properly either.
Yeah,
No, I mean, the idea is that they can be recycled and reused. I mean, our electric car, you were hoping to use that as a energy storage system.
Yes.
You know, from solar panels, just to store our excess electricity that currently goes out to the grid. We get paid for it, but we use it ourselves.
Okay, well, I think we should probably let you go ahead.
That's very kind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great.